So this week we're going to do a very in-depth analysis of public housing in America, around the world. What is it? What does it mean? Is it good? Is it bad? Are there better alternatives to make affordable housing? Well, we're going to all find out together. So what is public housing? So public housing, by definition, is actually pretty simple. It's just housing that is owned and operated by local government, federal government, municipality governments. That's what public housing means.
Owned, operated, developed, kind of everything. It's all run by the government.
Yeah, upkeep, all of it. The government's the landlord in a public housing unit. Affordable housing is different. Affordable housing could have private developers with private managers with funding that is subsidized by the government, perhaps, but that does not mean that it's public housing. So America has a long history with public housing, and I want to kind of give a little bit of an example of what it was like in public housing in New York City in the 30s up until today. So the New York City Housing Authority began in 1934 under Mayor LaGuardia. Mayor LaGuardia is very, very popular in New York, and he was a strong progressive coming off the backs of the New Deal revolution under FDR. Now, these units had a lot of problems, though. They pre-selected people based off of their history and made sure not to allow anyone into these public units that were ever reliant on social services. For the majority of these early years, no one who moved into these units had a history of public welfare. And it was very, very focused on admitting working middle-class people and white people. In the 60s, this began to change. It was opened up. Nietzsche?
Yeah.
Call it Nietzsche. That's New York City Housing Authority. I'm just going to call it that.
Call it Nietzsche because because Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Nietzsche. Okay. So by the 60s, Nietzsche was housing 500,000 people. That's insane. And again, majority white, majority no welfare recipients. But 1968, like in a lot of things in America, things change. The federal government, with push from social justice movements, forced New York City government to loosen their standards and let in more people who were struggling. And so, in many ways, these public housing units became safe harbors against crime in the community. Because Nietzsche had its own local police force, it was able to deal with its rising crime fairly effectively. And these units became safe harbors from the rest of the noise and the danger that was going on in the city. Nietzsche, again, was very, very well funded up until this point. And then when the 2000s came around, federal and local government money started to dry up and dry up fast. Apologies.
Tough.
So the money started drying up fast. And when the 2000s came along, so why did the money dry up fast? Well, it all comes back to this one amendment that was very, very important.
I have something to jump in here.
Oh, yeah, jump in.
With first. So in 1974, goodness gracious, where are my notes? In 1974, Nixon put a moratorium on housing spending because there were reports that public housing had become hotbeds for crime, that these buildings were all becoming dilapidated and run down, and it's because the government had been underspending on them. So even though before they had been kind of these safe havens, since in 1968, when they became more targeted to lower income people, when you put a bunch of desperate people without a lot of money in the same place packed together, you're oftentimes asking for trouble because it means that they're going to be competing with each other for the resources that they need most desperately. So there was truth to what Nixon said, but then he put a moratorium on the housing spending, and it didn't fix any of those issues, obviously, right? It just meant that they got worse, and the buildings the crime and the poor physical condition was left unabated. And so it led to the Hope 6 program in 1993, which demolished around 8% of the nation's public housing stock. And again, this was not the right solution at the time because it displaced a ton of the families that were living in that public housing. And so that decline that started with Nixon's moratorium has never been offset by new construction. And then you have the Faircloth Amendment coming in.
So in the Faircloth Amendment in 1999, it created a de facto ban on all new public housing by freezing the number of allowable units that could be constructed or operated by the PHA, which is the Public Housing Authority. So now public housing is totally kneecapped with the funding. It's stopped. A bunch of their buildings were demolished, and then it's impossible to expand them because they don't have the money to do so, and the federal government isn't allowed to do so. So there's really no avenue for public housing to get back on its feet here in the United States, really. But
without a repeal of the
Fair Cloth Amendment, which was actually something AOC fought for in her first year of Congress.
Yeah,
which is interesting it was cool to see her do that, because I feel like that's a little like nitty gritty policy wonky thing to go after.
It is. I've also seen criticism of that kind of approach taken because the idea is without zoning reform,
right,
it doesn't matter.
That's absolutely
technically
true.
Can build more housing according to the Fair Cloth Amendment, because we still don't have the space to do so.
Definitely. She did couple it with zoning reform.
Yeah.
She's a big advocate for that, but that's totally right. Repealing Fair Cloth does nothing if we don't have the space to build more houses.
Yeah.
But this doesn't mean that the United States is giving up on getting affordable housing, right? They've just changed the way that they've tried to do it. So now I want to talk about the low-income housing tax credit, which is the main way that the United States now gets affordable housing to people. So there are about 2 million tax credit units on the market today, and this grows by about 100,000 annually. The way that this is subsidized differs based off the number of tax incentives, but this is the general formulation. So you qualify for tax credits if you meet one of these requirements. Greater than 20% of your units are occupied by tenants at 50% or lower of the average median income, or greater than 40% of units are occupied by tenants of less than 60% of the average median income. So that is, if you meet any of those two requirements, you qualify for the low-income housing tax credit. And these have been fairly effective in a lot of ways, not so effective in others.
Yeah.
The way that has been effective is children who grow up in these low-income housing tax credit areas or housing credit buildings that are in richer areas. They have seen that their projected future earnings are much, much higher than their parents. They are way primed for success if they're in this environment. Now, this doesn't mean that it's totally great for the high income neighborhood that this housing credit funded place could be built in. That's just not the case. In higher neighborhood communities, those with median incomes above $54,000, this study was done in 2016, so that 54,000 is way different nowadays. Housing prices declined by approximately 2.5% within 1/10 of a mile of the project, and segregation actually increased. Notably, that the researchers found no crime impact, but these effects can be seen as much as 10 years out, and the effects radiate outward from the initial impact of the 1/10 of a mile. So that is definitely something to consider.
So crime is affected?
No,
or it's not?
Crime is not affected. Crime is not affected.
Okay, that's what I found too.
Okay.
I went kind of deep on low-income housing tax credit. I read one study focusing on developments in California that used it. And there's a lot. So I was curious, one, how efficient is this as a method for building? And one of the big problems is that the housing built with this tax credit is actually much more expensive to develop than others. And the reason for that is aligned with critiques of government, of big government that happen all the time, and its administrative burden. But also just the certain requirements the government places on these developers. So in California, 60% of subsidized housing projects trigger prevailing wage agreements, which drives labor costs about 20% higher than similar private projects. This is one of those things where we talk about unions very positively all the time, right? But we just had a really interesting discussion about whether teachers' unions were effective for children and whether education was a place where we should be scrutinizing more what exactly gets the best bang for our buck as far as spend. Maybe housing is a place that we want to do that too. the labor is more expensive, but developers in interviews also expressed the cost of dealing with the additional paperwork and the bureaucracy that they have to go to. Because it kind of reminds me of the high-speed rail discussion that we went through, where they're trying to be perfect, right? They give an example with local hire requirements, right? Which says, let's say there's 4 to 5 affordable housing developers in an area, and they've all been funded with the federal funding, and they all break ground at pretty much the same time, right? Then if you're required to hire, say you need framers for the windows, right? And you're supposed to hire local framers, minority-owned framers. You get a lot of these boxes that have to be checked, that now the costs for those, the demand for those are driven so high that the cost to build these houses are through the roof, and the government has to spend all of that for less housing, right? That's problematic to me. Governments can also have regulations on the timing of a project. Like in California, there's a 2-year window where they have to have the project done. Then they have to pay even more to rush everything through. And then the last example I'll give is developers have to present the funding they get from the bank and from the local governments to the state before they get the state funding for the low-income housing tax credit. So usually they need at least 3 other sources of funding before they go to the state. And acquiring that funding is difficult and timely because the financiers that are going to fund them locally and the banks, they don't want to be the first one to jump in. So they're all going to kind of drag it out. And the longer it takes, the more interest they're going to have to pay back on the financing. And so it's this vicious cycle where the government is trying to make everything done so right that it's actually making it that this housing is much more expensive than it needs to be.
And it's difficult, especially when these regulations are only falling on the burden of affordable housing. These regulations aren't falling on the burden of luxury housing.
Yes.
Right? And so that's when it gets really difficult. It's not like the regulations are across the board.
Mm-hmm.
These developers have the option of whether to do luxury or, condos or affordable housing. So when you make it difficult, if you're going to apply these regulations, it really should be blanketed if you're going to do it.
Yep.
Like if you're going to do it, I agree with a lot of them. If you're going to do it, you got to do it to all of these things. Don't just limit to the tax credit units, because now you're just de-incentivizing affordability.
Exactly. And you're charging the government so much more to gain affordability for fewer houses.
Right.
Another interesting thing on this is there was some reason that they would only build like 40 unit complexes or apartments versus much more cost efficient larger units. And I shouldn't have even brought that point up because I forget why that is more important.
We're struggling in Brookline, Massachusetts, because we just did a whole zoning reform. And there is definitely loopholes where developers could decide, I'm only going to build 3-unit housing and not have to do any affordability units at all.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
It's very hard to get all the developers in line. We'll talk about other countries and how they handle this, but the United States is not currently using a whip to make these things happen.
No,
in a lot of ways.
No, it's trying to use a carrot, and maybe the carrot doesn't smell good enough.
Right. Exactly.
The one other thing I'll say, I found the same thing about crime. That's the nice thing about not consolidating public housing and instead incentivizing low-income housing across the board in different localities, is that crime isn't affected at all.
Right.
However, what is affected is rents, because in this case, you are just putting more money into the local economy for rents, which means that landlords can drive them up, and that goes faster. So no matter what, you're kind of dealing with this trade-off.
Yeah. So I also found when these projects are built in low median income housing, in low median income areas, the researchers saw property values increase by 6.5% within a tenth of a mile of the project, and crime rates fell and diversity went up. Non-minority people moved into the city. White people moved into these areas where these were happening because you saw more development, you saw lower crime rates. You see now there's commercial development being done because now commercial sites say, oh wait, you know what? There's actually like a building with 40 people and all of them have subsidized housing, so they're going to be there.
Yeah.
All right. So now we have a good consumer base. We can go there.
Exactly.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
it's really almost seen as like a revitalization project for these local communities when this type of project gets built. So it's very, very positive in a lot of ways, has its downsides. A lot of the red tape that happens it's unfortunate that the regulation falls so hard on the people struggling the most.
Yeah.
It seems a little backwards, right? There isn't this much regulation when you're trying to build a mansion. In terms of like who you get your frames from and who you do all this from, right?
Yeah.
But it does fall when you're just trying to build more housing for struggling families.
Yeah, it's weird that like you can think about it like the rich can afford to have anyone do the job, but the government refuses to have anyone but exactly the people they want.
And they're doing it for good reason, right?
Yeah.
They're doing it for a noble cause, but is this the right place and time to fight it? I don't know.
I don't think so, but I think I'll get back to that at the end.
Yeah. So now let's go into some of the different. What do you think? Do you want to go into some of the different countries?
Yeah. Let's transition. We can maybe talk about Germany first.
Sure. Because Germany kind of resembles what goes on in America in a lot of ways right now today.
Yeah, exactly. So Germany. So specifically, I read an article that focused on Berlin, but it also talks about how housing is handled generally across the country. It started out with a really strong public housing policy. After World War II, of course, Berlin needed to be built back, right? And the government needed to invest a ton of money into doing that, especially when you think about West Berlin, which is surrounded on all sides by Soviet-controlled East Germany, right? Private investors aren't going to want to invest there. It doesn't seem like a safe investment at all. So it started out strong, and then over time it got weakened little by little, kind of similar to the story in the US, like we just talked about. It's consistently reduced public funding to housing, and now they reverted to revenue subsidies, which are like vouchers, and allocates them to the very needy, just like we do, right? We only allow low-income people, usually the baseline in the US is family income 80% or less than the median in the area. So Berlin has done something similar. Germany has done something similar. And Germany sees public housing as a temporary salve to acute market problems. The people at the very low end who need help, it's just like we need to get them out from the bottom, and then they'll be able to contribute normally to the economy. They'll be able to operate in the market without any government help. And so let's see, what else do I have here? And so Germany has just stayed on this demand side incentives, and it's been trying to invest less in public housing and get out of that whole business rather than investing more. And so in this article, I was really interested in the comparison between Berlin and Vienna, because the Berlin situation sounds a lot like what we have in the US in New York. Vienna, the capital of Austria, has a completely different setup for public housing. It is, I think we would agree, the biggest success story of public housing in the world.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about why it's so different in a good way. So Vienna's public sector, it again, like Berlin, it started kind of after World War II. It was also destroyed, and it's been consistently involved in the construction of new, permanently rent-controlled social housing, and now the government controls the majority of the housing in the entire city. The
only thing I would challenge you on is it began, like the fundamentals of this program started after World War I with the rise of the Socialist Party in Austria, right? When the socialists got elected into municipal government in Vienna in 1918, that's when they started this project of Red Vienna. And the era of 1918 to 1934 saw a lot of municipal building construction.
Yeah. I think you're right. I stand corrected on that. So in Austria, we have this interesting system. Social housing consists of three elements. You have public housing provided by municipalities. This covers I think like 15% across the country. It's like 20% in Vienna itself. Public housing, the municipality developers haven't really been involved in new development for that long. They've just been focused on maintenance and renovation. Then you have housing provided by limited profit housing associations, or LPHAs. These are kind of, I would say, the linchpin of the Viennese housing market.
Yeah.
This is the main importance difference maker. So LPHAs are restricted by many of the same things or restricted in many of the same ways as municipalities, in that they have to be rent controlled. They have to, their restrictions as far as what exactly they charge is the same. There are a lot of other things, but they can make profit, and yet they're required to reinvest all of their profit back into new housing development. And that's a huge deal that I'll come back to.
Yeah, and we're really it's one of those things where we're directing the benefits of the market only to the good parts, right? We're only allowing the capital to chase the socially desirable outcomes.
Exactly. And so then the last section is the private developers, who use public subsidies. And so that's the other element of the social housing. The private providers are still restricted to cost rent for the first 35 years of a project, but then it ends. So the important thing about these LPHAs is that they establish long-term housing stock at below market rates for the majority of the population. We have something like 30-40%, I don't have the exact numbers here, of housing that is built, maintained, operated by these LPHAs. And this is constantly growing because of that rule that they have to reinvest the profits. Mm-hmm. They have to provide cost rent throughout the entire term of the lease, or of the building existing there. And the rents have to include an amount for maintenance, meaning that the LPHA developments are often the best kept, which is a huge deal considering how dilapidated some of the U.S. public housing developments get. Mm-hmm. This is in contrast to Germany, which puts limits on how long even its little bit of social housing has to be kind of subsidized or below market rate rents, which ends after a period of between 20 and 40 years. So there's this fundamental problem. There's this fundamental difference where in Germany, all of the social housing is slowly going away.
Right.
All of the social housing is eventually becoming market rate housing. So the government has to keep coming up with new investments. It has to keep choosing to put more money into public housing to meet demand. Whereas in Vienna, you have reinvestment constantly, automatically happening into the market. And that's kind of what you need.
Right. And Vienna's main linchpin is that they always strive for a housing surplus. Mm-hmm. Always. Mm-hmm. They always want downward pressure on rents on the market so that the market can't just run away with it.
Yeah.
And this constrains private landlords from running away with it completely. Mm-hmm. And only 7.4% of rental properties in Vienna are for profit.
Yeah.
That's only 7.4%.
That's huge.
And the way that rent controls operate in Vienna are also impressive because they're not like strict. They're not like you can only increase rent 3.5% over each year. Mm-hmm. They say that a tenant cannot pay any more than 20 to 25% of their income, mm-hmm. which is fantastic. That's already better than the U.S. because when we have affordable housing schemes like that, it's 30% of income, not 20 to 25. So that's already something.
It's great. And so Vienna usually charges rent at cost, which means what was the cost of development, what was the cost of the financing and the interest that they have to pay off mm-hmm. on it. And the people who are living in the housing receive subsidies if they need to push their rent down to that 20 or 25% number.
Now, you might not know the answer to this question, but I think I want to ask it. Do we know how, if they're only paying the rent for cost, do we know how the LPHA gets reserve money to build new housing and expand?
Well, so I think they're able to profit once they've paid off their loans.
Oh, sure. Got it.
So once they have no more costs on the developments. I mean, they have maintenance costs, but the rents that are determined for the post-financing segment of time are still above the maintenance costs. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the profit that they use to reinvest.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. So Vienna, honestly, it's the best example globally of a public housing system that's extremely effective.
Yeah.
And they also have extremely good tenant protections. They don't they have a lot of housing production, and they don't sacrifice tenants' rights on behalf of expanded production.
Yeah. They have a lot of housing production, good tenant rights. The majority is public social housing, or at least the majority is social housing. And that's a huge deal because it means that the private sector really has to reckon with competing with it. But it's also not so overpowering that private investors are completely scared off, right? Because this also makes for a really stable environment for investment. You know that the government is going to keep this system, and you know that eventually there will be profits to be had because it requires continuous investment and it wants those profits. So I think an interesting question that was posed at the end of this article is, what can Berlin take from Vienna? And thus, what can any other neoliberal shifting housing government take from Vienna? Mm-hmm. The main thing is Berlin, or the US, plug them in, would need to change its system so that expenditures have a lasting effect. Right? So you can't have the phase out of affordable housing. You can't have investors in affordable housing who are looking to get out at a certain point. Vienna does this with land registration, where the developer is registered to that land forever once they develop it. And so they are invested in constantly maintaining it and constantly drawing in people for new rents. They suggested Berlin would have to do something like this. They say tax exemptions are a successful instrument because the Viennese government gives tax exemptions to the private developers even that develop social housing there. And it basically shows that the state can create these framework conditions and incentive structures that make it possible to attract private actors and give enough power to public actors to achieve social goals. But it's very clear that you need a lot of regulation to get there.
And you also need a lot of public buy-in. Mm-hmm. And Vienna really succeeded with that because they don't kick people out if they become wealthy while they're in public housing.
Yeah.
Right? They don't encourage like the welfare trap that has become prominent talking point in American politics, right? People aren't discouraged to make less money in fear of losing the right to live in their home. Yeah. That doesn't happen. So this encourages strong social integration with where they're living. And it's also important because that means people of different economic strata are living side by side. They're living near each other.
Yeah.
They're commuting to work together. Their kids are going to the same school. And that embeds social cohesion, which makes public housing that much more politically viable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about France because France does it significantly different from everything that we've mentioned.
Yeah.
France is they're just doing their own thing. In 2000, France passed, I'm not going to try to say what it is, the Law on Urban Solidarity and Renewal. This required most cities to dedicate 20% of their housing stock to affordable housing and imposed serious penalties if they didn't comply. Now, cities that failed to meet that 20% faced budgetary fines. They lost the power to issue building permits, and the central government could enact domain to actually take their land and just build affordable housing units on it. Reforms in 2013 made the law even stronger and upped it to 25% affordable housing by the year 2025. So this is it's just insane to me.
Yeah.
The data has shown that the wealthiest cities have increased their share of social housing to 4.4% by 2017.
Okay.
That's more than 5 times the amount of social housing as what they had in 1999. So there is move in the right direction.
Okay.
But it's obviously not everything that France wanted to achieve by this. And it's just a very different approach, right? This is just beating the local governments with a stick.
Yes.
So
totally.
Which I'm not totally against. As like I know it's hard,
yeah,
but I definitely would like to have a more central authority saying, hey, all you neighborhoods in New York, all around Long Island,
sure,
you need to build 20% affordable housing. You don't have a choice. Figure out how to do it. And then also pass tax credits to make it possible, do this to make it possible, blah, blah, blah.
Sure. It depends on your enforcement mechanisms.
Yeah.
Because if you're not really strictly enforcing, then putting out that kind of a tone is going to drive everyone away.
Right.
So we've talked about all of these different examples. We've talked about the US and New York. We've talked about Germany. We've talked about Vienna. We've talked about France. Where do we land? Let's not just be reporters who say everything that happens.
Right.
What does our analysis lead us to? I have a few points on this. So we talked about public subsidized housing and we talked about public housing. Honestly, through this discussion and everything I've read, I'm skeptical that public housing could ever work in the US.
I'm skeptical that it could be built out strong enough now. Yeah, I agree.
I think you honestly need a system like Vienna's to do it, which takes continuous investment over time. It takes really strict government regulation on housing and how it's developed. And I can't imagine us ever having the political appetite. We need progressive waves like we've never seen before.
Yeah.
To get to that point.
I don't think it's a worthwhile, like, I think it's a worthwhile fight. I think it, like, on the local level, I talk a lot with the Brookline Housing Authority with my position here, and they do a lot of good. And I don't think giving the Brookline Housing Authority money to build a new affordable housing unit in Brookline is a waste of money. I don't think that's the case.
Okay.
I think because there aren't tax incentives set up at a lot of these local levels to do such a thing, right? In the federal case, I think it could be better for the tax, because it's all about where do you get the best bang for your buck at the end of the day.
Yes.
Right. It's all where do you get the most amount of affordable housing at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I also agree that it seems like tax incentives for affordable units are the way to do it. I also think there has to be some centralized push to make it happen across the country.
Okay.
And so it's not up to just local communities to whether or not they want to do it. They have to do it, and they have to figure out how to do it. The federal government will give them the tools to do it, but you have to accept the tools.
Okay. So something like the MBTA Communities Act.
Exactly.
Which forces, but that's forcing zoning.
Right.
That forces making it possible.
I'd want all of it.
Yeah. It doesn't force actually doing it.
Right. I would want all of it. I would want the forcing of the zoning changes. I want the forcing of implementing affordable housing units with the credits, finding developers willing to do it.
Yeah. But to be clear, this is not the same as public housing,
right,
as far as publicly owned, publicly developed.
Right. This is not bought by the government. It's not that.
Yeah. So we're kind of on the same page there, which I think is an important thing to point out, because I think in the past we've noted that we are in favor of public housing because it seemed like the only way to control rents. But I think it only works if you have the system done the right way. And just like we talked about in Germany and in Berlin, it doesn't work if you're only trying to lift up this underprivileged group of the population that's economically disadvantaged, because you're going to always have political pushback. You're going to have the welfare trap where if people make too much money that they fall out of it. You're going to have not enough funding for the housing because you're always going to be trying to skimp, even though it's housing for the people who need it the most.
Yeah.
And so I think I agree. It's in here, the only way that really can work is the government giving out funding.
Yeah.
And I think, like, my point on what needs to be reformed is we need to clear some of that red tape. We need to realize that the perfect is getting in the way of the good, that requiring local contractors, local special contractors, local builders, minority-owned companies is getting in the way of the housing targets that we need to achieve. So I think we need to have government money invested into development of low-income housing, but we also need to allow the companies to operate as they would in the private sector more freely or more uninhibited.
Would you not? Okay, I'm going to push back a little bit, because I do believe that some of the red tape is, like, I think that having those regulations in place are not necessarily bad. And I don't think I'm totally convinced that our issues with building housing is because of those things. I don't think. I would honestly like to see those types of regulations expanded into the rest of the private market, so that you have to compete equally with the private market with the same issues. So developers are incentivized to go into the other avenue there.
I don't think so. I don't think you need to have local suppliers for everything. I don't think you need to have minority-owned companies do everything. I think there's probably and I don't think you can even really consider making those the regulations if that's going to be the case for the public and the private sector for all housing development. They only look at it that way because they know it's only going to be a pocket of development, right? And because they think in this pocket of development will lift up like developers who need it more. And plus you have to think if you did do that to the private sector and you have the developers who receive those tax credits giving interviews about how hard it is, how much money it adds, how much time it adds to their process, then now you're going to add that to everyone's process. And you're just going to add that much more money that needs to go into the housing in general.
No, I understand that, but I think you may be discounting slightly the revitalization aspects that come with using local suppliers in these communities, right? There is economic gains there that wouldn't have been seen otherwise. And by utilizing local suppliers, as we talked about, one of the benefits of the LTH, the low income housing tax credit, is a 6.5% increase in property values, which I think comes from possibly utilizing more local amenities. So
I think even if that's true, we have to think about cost benefit here. And right now we're in a housing crisis where we're 6 million units short of what we need in this country. And even if I think it's okay to do that down the line, but right now we need to clear the road for more housing. And we have developers specifically saying this red tape is so much of a headache that I spend less money. I give it less attention than I otherwise would because it's a total pain in my ass.
Okay, look, I also think it might be true that building affordable housing isn't the place to be fighting for local business development and minority improvement. It might not be the place to do that. There are other avenues and other times to have that fight. That might not be the avenue to have it.
Yeah.
That might not be the pocket of money that you should be taking from to make it happen.
Yeah, especially because of this housing shortage, hopefully if you clear up some of the zoning regulations, if you reform them, then the demand for housing will actually start to the supply will start to respond to the demand. The supply of the labor will start to respond to the demand. And you won't have to worry about giving these specific groups of developers a boost themselves because the whole market is just going to be expanding so much that everyone's going to have plenty of work.
Yeah, I guess. But I'm gonna only I'll leave you my disagreement here. I'm just weary of accepting the developers saying that red tape is the issue because I feel like the developer will always say red tape will be the issue. I don't think there's ever a time where a developer won't. They're always going to be incentivized to want less regulation, right?
Yes.
So it's hard. You know what I mean?
Yes, but you're on board for zoning reform.
Totally, 100%.
Zoning is red tape that was put in for well-meaning reasons.
Yes.
I mean, oftentimes not well-meaning reasons.
No. Actually, yeah.
But sometimes, like with environmental regulation.
Yeah.
Right. So this means that more zoning reform will mean that more housing or more building is done, hopefully, in my opinion, with less scrutiny on the environmental effects.
Yes.
Because even though I care about what the environmental effects are legitimately, that is a cost that we have to be willing to pay.
Right.
And we just have to be willing to pay more of the costs for a housing crisis that is as bad as we currently have in this country.
Yeah. At the end of the day, we're in pretty much agreement.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to learn more about public housing, its flaws, its benefits.
Yeah.
I really want, one of the things I really wish we could take from public housing from Vienna at these local levels, if we're not going to do it with a federal program and stuff, but I would like to see more of an economic integration with these public housing units. Because I feel like that could start building momentum if we start small.
What do you mean?
Well, because we talked about the welfare trap and how if you make too much money in a public housing unit, you get kicked out.
Yeah.
I would like to see getting rid of something like that in the United States.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think that would do really good things.
Yeah.
I think if you can have public housing, even if like it started as middle class or even upper class public housing, but again, I think you would kind of need regulations like Vienna, because if you don't limit it to low income, then what's stopping them from continuing to use the public subsidies, but also just providing like super luxury housing?
Oh yeah, of course.
To the highest income people.
Yeah.
So I think you need something like you have to reinvest these profits, or maybe you reinvest a percentage of the profits in lower income housing. I really like that idea, because then you're building the overall housing stock and you're slowly increasing the amount of low income housing you have.
Yeah. All right.
Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was really fun to learn about.
Amazing.
We're good.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye.